Welcome, everyone, to a new series that I'm starting where I will pretty much be reading from books, various history books that I happen to have in my possession, to kind of do something a little different from my usual content. So to start today, we're going to read from the Napoleonic Wars by Richard Holmes. And pretty much this book is going to cover the entire Napoleonic Wars, as the title suggests. We'll read through 2 to 3 chapters per episode, because they're relatively small chapters. We're going to start with the introduction, the Age of Napoleon. Few periods of history are more resonantly defined by the name of one man, Napoleon. Napoleon bestrode early 19th century Europe like the proverbial colossus. By 1812, most of the continent was under his control. His writ ran from southern Spain to the Baltic, and from the Atlantic to Russia. He had defeated all but one of the great powers, and save for Britain's moat defensive, it is hard to see how the country could have been spared. He had installed family members on half a dozen thrones, dictated terms to the heads of ancient dynasties, and married the Holy Roman Emperor's daughter. He had recast his country's administrative, educational, and legal systems, stabilized its currency, and set up the Bank of France, created a new aristocracy, and instituted the Légion d'honneur. He was a patron of the arts and filled French museums with the spoils of his conquests. He was the towering figure of his age and foresaw that his achievements would make it impossible for even opponents to ignore him. It will be difficult to make me disappear from the public memory. French historians will have to deal with the empire and will have to give me my rightful due. But what is his rightful due? As you look back at Napoleon, it is difficult not to be both attracted and repelled. And in my own lifetime, I have rarely been able to strike a balanced view. My mother took me to Paris when I was 10 years old, and the sight of Napoleon's tomb shining coldly beneath the dome of Les Invalides stirred my emotions in a way that I still remember today. When I was researching for my doctorate in the archives at Béziers, I was within musket shot of the ditch where the Duc d'Enghien, kidnapped from neutral Baden, was shot by a firing squad in 1804. The victim of judicial murder, my former idol had blood on his hands. On a dozen battlefields, from Austerlitz to Wagram, I have seen a man who could defeat huge armies as he did at Austerlitz, pulverize the military giant of its day as he did at Jena, and dart between larger opponents, lunging at each in turn as he did in France in 1814. He could inspire the fiercest loyalty. When Napoleon was hit in the ankle at Ratisbonne in 1809, there was a rumor that he was badly wounded, and men flocked in from all directions. Light cavalry officer Marcelin Marbeau saw how, in a moment, thousands of men surrounded Napoleon in spite of the enemy cannon fire, which concentrated on this huge group. In 1803, young Charles Perkin, a trooper in the Chasseurs de Cheval, was a sentry outside Napoleon's quarters. I still recall with what joy and pride I did sentry duty outside the apartment he was occupying. I did not think I have ever known a finer experience than my sentry duty outside the door of a man on whom the eyes of all Europe were already fixed. A young officer, mortally wounded before taking a message to Napoleon, braced up for his last duty. "You're wounded," said the emperor. "No, sire. Killed," said the youngster proudly. When General Levisque de la Fière was having his leg amputated in 1814, during the operation, which he bore with great courage, the general repeatedly called out, "Long live the emperor." Yet Napoleon could inspire such behavior with utter cynicism. He said that a man would not sell his life, but would give it away for a piece of ribbon. If he was merciless to Anakin, he could be brutal on a far larger scale. In 1799, he ordered his men to kill perhaps 2,000 Turkish prisoners, some of whom were bayoneted to save ammunition. He was a consummate liar. When a secretary, penning a characteristically mendacious dispatch for him, acknowledged that, "I had found it painful recording these official words at his dictation," Napoleon retorted, "You are a simpleton. You really don't understand a thing." He could be callous, telling his wife Josephine that he was divorcing her because she could not conceive. "Madam, I need a womb." He could not distinguish the interests of France from his own, leading one historian who suggested that 3 million men were killed in his wars to claim that the memory of Genghis Khan paled in comparison. So there is no simple view to take. A figure of Napoleon's extraordinary stature both dazzles and burns. We're now going to begin with Chapter 1, the Revolutionary Background. But before the French Revolution, Napoleone de Bonaparte, who until 1796 customarily spelled his name in the Italian fashion, might never have come to history's notice, remaining just an obscure artillery officer. However, when a blast of radical change blew away most of those in authority, from King Louis XVI himself to many junior officers and minor officials, it swept in new men, several of whom speedily fell victim to a monster which devoured its own children. For the agile and ambitious, this was a time of extraordinary opportunity, as well as great danger. The revolution's proximate cause was the summoning of the Estates General, a national assembly with medieval antecedents, representing the nobility, the clergy, and the Third Estate, all those belonging to neither of the two preceding classes, to discuss finances. These had been ruined by the American War of Independence, in which France played a decisive part in helping Britain's colonies throw off their yoke. Deeper causes included resistance to absolute monarchy amongst the largely tax-exempt privileged classes. Royal authority was weakened by the growing revolt of the Estates General, and as Maximilien Robespierre, who became a leader of the extremists, admitted, the people appeared on the scene only later. They were encouraged to do so because a bad harvest in 1788 followed a period of economic deterioration, characterized by high unemployment. Food shortages were exacerbated by rumors that monopolists were causing scarcity for their own ends. The Third Estate constructed its program based on cahiers, lists of grievances, which testified, amongst other things, to the desire of the urban middle class to gain equality with the more privileged, and for the peasants to escape obligations rooted in the feudal past. The Estates General met on 5th of May, 1789, and on the 17th of June, the Third Estate, exacerbated by the ruling that the estates should sit and vote separately, declared itself the National Assembly, and a number of noblemen and clergy joined it. In an atmosphere full of wild rumors, the crowds that thronged the capital sought arms to defend themselves against a military coup. Early on the 14th of July, they found some at Les Invalides and moved on to the Bastille, a fortress and state prison on the eastern edge of Paris, which surrendered after a brief defense. 3 days later, Louis went to the Hôtel de Ville to receive the new national cockade of red, white, and blue. But on 6th of October, a mob invaded the king's palace at Versailles and took him back to Paris. The Declaration of Rights, passed by the Assembly on the 26th of August, had affirmed that men were free and equal, and that sovereignty resided in the people. Church lands were sold off, and paper money was issued. And the Constituent Assembly discussed wholesale reform. As old institutions were swept away, real power resided in the political clubs like the Jacobins and the Cordeliers. In June of 1791, the king and queen failed in an escape attempt, and although Louis had a new monarchical constitution, things were spiraling out of control. In August of 1791, Austria and Prussia affirmed their readiness to help Louis. Meanwhile, France itself became increasingly bellicose, declaring war on Austria and Prussia in April of the following year. Early French reverses and counter-revolutionary movements in the provinces encouraged the growth of extremism, and in August of 1792, the Paris mob stormed the Tuileries. A national convention, elected by universal suffrage, replaced the Legislative Assembly. This new body declared France a republic, but in early September, the mob massacred hundreds of prisoners, showing how unstable things had become. In January of 1793, Louis was executed for treason, and the next month, the convention went on to declare war on Britain and Holland. The new executive, the Committee of Public Safety, was supported by a convention purged of moderates and dominated by the left-wing majority called the Mountain. In a spasm of terror, the guillotine claimed the lives of Queen Marie Antoinette, counter-revolutionaries, unsuccessful generals, and revolutionaries alike. The revolutionary Camille Desmoulins quipped that the gods were thirsty, but himself died in the spring of 1794, when members of two rival factions were guillotined. From the 10th of June to the 27th of July, some 1,376 prisoners were executed in Paris, dismaying politicians who feared that they too would be engulfed. On the 28th and 29th of July, Robespierre and his Jacobin adherents, authors of the worst extremism, were themselves executed. This Thermidorian reaction was consolidated when the army supported the convention against the mob in May of 1795, and a new constitution was ratified by plebiscite. On the 5th of October, the mob again assailed the convention, but was dispersed by troops. The cannon whose whiff of grapeshot winnowed the rioters were commanded, as we shall soon see, by a young brigadier general called Napoleon Bonaparte. A new executive, the Directory, now worked with a moderate convention to bring the first stability France had enjoyed for 6 years. We will now enter Chapter 2, The Making of a Reputation. On the 15th of August, 1769, Letizia Bonaparte was hurried to her home in the Corsican capital, Ajaccio, to give birth to a boy, who was christened Napoleonic. His father, Carlo Maria, who now called himself Charles, was a lawyer who had supported Pauli's Corsican nationalists, but after their defeat by the French earlier in the same year, had gone on well with the authorities and served as a municipal councillor. He capitalized on his status in the minor nobility to secure support for his burgeoning family, and in 1779, Napoleon, for such we will now call him, entered the royal school at Brienne in Champagne with a scholarship. The boy was unhappy. His small stature and appalling French encouraged bullying, but he would not be coerced. When a master sought to make him eat on his knees, he riposted, "In my family we kneel only before God." His reports were mixed. Most testified to academic success, especially in mathematics, but also to an imperious and stubborn character. In October of 1784, aged just 15, he moved to the École Militaire in Paris. Hopeless at drill in German, he again excelled at mathematics, though when he was commissioned into the artillery in 1785, he ranked 42nd out of 52 students. Stationed at Valence, Napoleon spent much of his time in private study. In 1787, he enjoyed a long leave trying to sort out family affairs, for his father had just died and did not return to his regiment. Now at Action until June of 1788. Here he was influenced by the talented commandant of the artillery school, Baron Dutel, who not only developed Napoleon's skills in gunnery, but helped lay the foundations of the tactical concepts which he would later develop to such outstanding effect. However, he was dismally short of money, and in 1788 endured a long illness. On the 1st of April, 1792, Napoleon was elected lieutenant colonel in the Ajaccio Volunteers, but helped suppress riots too vigorously, and earned the displeasure of Paoli. He then heard that his regiment in France had ordered a snap muster of all officers, and had struck his name from its rolls. Napoleon rushed to Paris, where he witnessed the storming of the Tuileries, and returned confirmed as a regular captain and volunteer lieutenant colonel. Napoleon's baptism of fire occurred in Sardinia, where in early 1793, an expedition from Corsica was ignominiously repulsed. Worse, it was clear that he was now unwelcome in Corsica, and in June of 1793, he moved his family to France and resumed his duties there. While he was collecting a gunpowder convoy, a royalist revolt broke out in the Midi, and Napoleon helped suppress it. Unrest spread to Toulon, which admitted an Anglo-Spanish fleet. Napoleon replaced General Carteau's wounded artillery commander, and his fierce energy and consummate professional skill made him the hero of a siege which ended victoriously on the 19th of December. He was made temporary brigadier general 3 days later, and confirmed in the rank in February of 1794. Napoleon, friend of Robespierre's brother, and author of a Jacobin-inspired play, was imprisoned in August after the Thermidorian reaction. Released 2 weeks later, he helped ensure a satisfactory end to the year's campaigning in Italy. But, exacerbating at being shunted off to an insignificant command, resigned. Military reversals led to his rapid reinstatement, but he was again removed from the army, and Napoleon was technically a civilian when Paul Barras, a member of the Directory, summoned him on the 5th of October, 1795, to protect the Convention against the insurrection. Napoleon opened fire on the Paris mob with artillery, his whiff of grape shot effectively ending the revolt. His action on that day was decisive. By its end, his political support matched his military reputation. With Chapter 3, Artillery. A gunner by training, Napoleon affirmed that great battles are won by artillery, and paid particular attention to its use, especially that of his belles filles, the 12-pounders which he sought to mass against the crucial point of his opponent's position. The artillery Napoleon inherited had suffered less than other arms from the purges and immigrations which accompanied the Revolution. In the 1760s and 1770s, French artillery had been reorganized according to the system devised by Jean-Baptiste Vaquet de Gribeval, with standardized 4, 8, and 12-pounders, 6-inch howitzers, carriages, ammunition wagons, and tools. Gribeval introduced elevating screws instead of wedges and accurately made barrels and ammunition, which ensured that shot fit snugly, enabling propellant charges and thus barrel weights, to be reduced without loss of range. Siege artillery was heavier, for its balls had to penetrate the squat ramparts that then characterized fortification. Mortars whose explosive projectiles were fired at a high angle were primarily used in sieges. The 4-pounders were regimental pieces, assigned to the infantry. And in 1804 to 1805, as part of a change of equipment to the system of the year 8, Napoleon replaced them with captured 6-pounders. These proved too heavy and led to the brief abandonment of regimental artillery. It was reintroduced in 1809, but all the regimental pieces were then lost from the retreat from Moscow and were not replaced. The same year 8 reforms increased the proportion of 12-pounders and brought a 24-pounder howitzer into service. By 1813, Napoleon sought to have a ratio of 5 guns of all types for every 1,000 men in his army, but this was never achieved. Gun detachments varied from the 8 trained gunners and 7 assistants serving the 12-pounder to 6 and 4 men respectively. For a 4-pounder, a gun was loaded by having its barrel swabbed to extinguish smoldering residue from the previous charge. A cartridge, black powder contained in fabric, was inserted into the muzzle and rammed home, and a projectile followed. Often cartridge and projectile were united to form a fixed ammunition. One of the detachment poked a pricker into the touch hole to pierce the cartridge, and inserted a firing tube of fine gunpowder. The weapon was aimed, and was fired by having a port fire, a length of smoldering quick match on short staff, applied to its touch hole. The recoil hurled the gun backwards, and the detachment, using hand spikes and ropes, hauled it back into position before the process recommenced. A 12-pounder might get off 1 round a minute, with lighter pieces managing 2 or maybe even 3. Napoleonic cannon fired 4 sorts of projectile. Most common was the iron round shot, whose weight defined the piece. The 12-pounder ball was 11.7 centimeters, or 4.6 inches in diameter. It had a maximum range of some 1,650 meters, or 1,800 yards. Canister or case shot had numerous balls contained in a tin container, which burst at the cannon's muzzle. A 12-pounder light canister contained 112 balls, and the heavy version had 46 larger ones. The heavy canister of a 12-pounder could reach out to 550 meters, or 600 yards. Common shell, the preferred projectile for howitzers, was an iron globe filled with powder ignited by a fuse. Fuses were unreliable, making it dangerous to fire over one's own troops. And shells often burst into a few large pieces, which limited their lethality. A type of British shell called shrapnel or spherical case contained musket balls as well as a bursting charge, and was intended to explode in the air above its target. Carcass, also fired from howitzers, ignited to produce illumination or to set fire to combustible targets. Foot artillery, whose gunners marched alongside their horse-drawn pieces, and which accompanied infantry formations, might achieve 15 to 25 kilometers, or 10 to 15 miles a day. Horse artillery accompanied cavalry, and the gunners were all mounted on ammunition limbers or on horses to maintain speed. Although Napoleon's artillery was rarely decisive on its own, there were times when its concentrated fire shook opposing infantry so badly as to render it incapable of resisting a French onslaught. This was Napoleon's plan for Waterloo, his last battle, and had the ground been firm enough to permit him to get his great battery of 84 12-pounders into action sooner, the fortunes of the day might have been different. We will now enter Chapter 4, the Italian Campaign. In the aftermath of Vendemiaire, Napoleon was promoted to the General of Division and appointed Commander of the Army of the Interior, but his real interest lay in Italy. Here the French and Austrians were in sharp contention, and he repeatedly criticized Schere's conduct of operations there, inducing the Directory to give him command of the Army of Italy, replacing Scherer in March of 1796. The strategic plan had been established by Lazare Carnot, the engineer officer and mathematician turned Republican politician and strategist. France, assailed by numerous opponents, had to carry the war into enemy territory, and Carnot planned to use 5 field armies to fight a coordinated campaign in southern Germany and northern Italy. In late March, Napoleon reached Nice and assumed command of a threadbare army with just 37,000 effectives. He was 26, and some senior officers attributed his appointment to politics, thinking that his recent marriage to Josephine Beauharnais, former mistress of Paul Barras, was part of the plot. Napoleon lost no time in disabusing them. He jabbed forward and beat the Austrians at Montenotte on the 12th of April, but heavy fighting in the middle of the month was inconclusive. He regrouped, and on the 21st of April, took the well-stocked arsenal at Mondovi from the Piedmontese, persuading them to seek an armistice and freeing him to deal with the Austrians. Napoleon crossed the River Po by sending Massena and Sourières to fix Austrian attention on Valenza, while the rest of the army lunged eastward to cross at Piacenza. Beaulieu, the Austrian commander, was shaken by the speed of the advance and fell back towards Cremona. On the 10th of May, Napoleon caught his rear guard at Lodi, on the river Adda. Milan fell 5 days later, and the spoils of the city enabled Napoleon to pay his army in cash for the first time. Napoleon had to deal with risings in Milan and Pavia before pushing Beaulieu along the shores of Lake Garda and gaining possession of the whole Lombard plain. The powerful fortress of Mantua, however, held out, and French communications were stretched thinly across the recently conquered territory. At this juncture, Wurmser arrived with Austrian reinforcements, collected Beaulieu's scattered forces, and advanced on Mantua, down both sides of Lake Garda. Napoleon was in real trouble, with outlying detachments driven in and lines of communication cut. He had to raise the siege of Mantua. However, Augereau checked the Austrian advance at Castiglione on the 5th of August, enabling Napoleon to concentrate and defeat Wurmser's main body. Napoleon again besieged Mantua, and then, moving at lightning pace that characterized the campaign, triumphantly outmaneuvered Wurmser, who found himself blockaded in Mantua. In November, the Austrians committed 2 more armies under Dalvinci and Davidovich to a 2-pronged attack, but Napoleon, now at the very height of his powers, jinked around Dalvinci's flank, secured the crucial bridge over the Adige at Arcola, and won a 3-day battle on the 15th and 17th of November that sent the 3rd Austrian counteroffensive reeling back. Duly reinforced, Dalvinci tried again, but was beaten at Rivoli on the 14th of January 1797, and Mantua surrendered on the 2nd of February. Napoleon now faced a fresh army under the Archduke Charles, but had reached the Semmering Pass, from where his advance guard could glimpse the spires of Vienna, when an armistice was agreed in April. Though Napoleon's conduct of the campaign was not perfect, he had excelled in concentrating at the decisive point, and his personal courage, vital energy, and inspirational words had made him the army's darling. It was a stunning debut. We will now enter into Chapter 5, Infantry. The infantrymen made up the most numerous component of any Napoleonic army, trudging the roads in rain or shine, and often deciding battles by the fire of his musket or the shock of his bayonet. Most French foot soldiers carried the 1777 pattern flintlock musket or its war production 1793 version. To load it, the soldier taught the process in 21 drill movements. Bit open a paper cartridge, keeping the round lead musket ball in his mouth. He trickled some powder into the priming pan and snapped the steel shut on top of it. Then he put the remaining powder into the muzzle, spat the ball on top of it, and rammed in the cartridge as wadding. To fire, he brought the musket up to his shoulder, thumbing the cock back as he did so. When he pressed the trigger, the cock shot forward, the flint gripped in its jaws, hit the steel, striking a spark that ignited the powder in the pan, and flashed through the touch hole to fire the weapon. But sometimes the flint would not spark, or the touch hole was blocked by residue. men had to replace flints and use a picker hung from a crossbelt or button to unblock the touch hole. In heavy rain, priming pans got soaked. On the Katzbach in 1813, in the rain, 3/4 of the muskets would not fire. A trained soldier could fire 3 rounds in a minute, but for a line of infantry, this might fall to 4 rounds in 3 minutes. Musketry was effective against a large target at 100 meters or 110 yards, and dangerous at 200 meters or 220 yards. Bullets might carry up to 500 meters or 550 yards, but at this distance they rarely killed. Rifles whose grooved barrels gave them better range and accuracy, but a slower rate of fire, were carried by some skirmishers. In 1789 there were 101 French regiments of infantry with royal or regional titles. After the Revolution, these became numbered, and in 1793 they were abolished in favor of 198 demi-brigades, each with 3 battalions, 1 from the old army and 2 of volunteers. Numbered regiments, 90 line and 27 light, replaced demi-brigades in 1803, and by January of 1813 there were 169 regiments, 133 of infantry of the line, and the remainder light. Although light infantry paid special attention to skirmishing, the practical difference between these and line regiments diminished. Detailed organization varied, but a regiment, commanded by its colonel, contained 2 to 4 battalions, each under its chef de bataillon. Typically, a battalion might have 6 center companies and 2 elite companies, a grenadier company and a light company. Grenadiers, the biggest and bravest men, could spearhead an assault or advance at the rear to buttress the faint-hearted. The light company contained the best shots, who often skirmished ahead of the battalion, using cover and firing independently. A company, in theory comprising 120 men, was commanded by a captain, with a lieutenant and a sous-lieutenant. 2 to 4 regiments formed a brigade, and 2 or more brigades, often with a battery of artillery, comprised an infantry division. According to the 1808 organization, a battalion numbered 834 men, plus a small battalion staff. In practice, however, a battalion's field strength early in the campaign was usually around 600, reducing as the campaigns wore on. In 1811, in Portugal, for example, Massena's battalions averaged around 350 men. Training was based on the regulation of 1791, which emphasized the methodical execution of drill movements. 18th century theorists had debated the relative merits of the line, which maximized firepower, and the column, the most expeditious means of moving troops cross-country, and which gave the best chance of breaking the enemy's line by physical and psychological shock. The immigration of many officers and the arrival of poorly trained volunteers meant that French infantry of the 1790s had little chance of adhering to the drill book, but instead showed a natural aptitude for advancing in column, preceded by swarms of skirmishers, whose fire might unsettle the enemy and enable the column to put in a bayonet charge. Later, various forms of ordre mixte, with part of a unit in line and part in column, were widely used. It is not true to assert that the British always fought in line and the French in column, although their 2-deep line, in contrast to the 3-deep line of most other armies, did enable the British to make best use of their available manpower. Wellington showed particular aptitude for sheltering his lines behind crests of hills or ridges, so that attacking French columns were often subjected to accurate close-range fire with little warning. One colonel told the author Stendhal that in 3 years his regiment had put 36,000 men through its ranks. It was difficult to produce sufficient trained officers and NCOs. In 1811, Napoleon complained that he had found a sergeant with less than a year's service and 19 corporals with under 2. Repeat the order that no NCO will be appointed without 3 years' service, he wrote. Some infantry sent to Russia in 1812 did not understand how, when skirmishing, to use the rise and fall of the ground, but instead maneuvered mechanically. And as standards declined, generals often responded by using huge columns that maximized control and cohesion. In 1814, one general could only move his troops in mass when the officers and file closers could keep them formed up. Book Chapter 6, Egypt and Syria. Secure in his domination of Italy, Napoleon turned to the Mediterranean and Egypt in a campaign intended to throttle Britain's eastern commerce. In 1797, Napoleon dominated northern Italy, returning to France after peace was made with Austria at Campo Formio that October. He was lionized in Paris and was delighted by his election to the Institut de France, a learned society comprising 5 academies, including the Académie de Français. Although he had little time for the directors, he agreed with them on one main issue. The Directory was anxious to humble Britain, whose Prime Minister William Pitt was seeking to assemble a new anti-French coalition. Napoleon concurred. The British were scheming and active, but if they were destroyed, then Europe is at our feet. Given command of the Army of England in 1798, he decided that invasion was impossible without control of the sea. He concluded, however, that the capture of Egypt would be conclusive, enabling the French to invade India or to lacerate the commerce upon which Britain depended. How this could be accomplished in the face of the British Royal Navy was never adequately explained. With the expedition almost ready to leave, relations with Austria worsened, and Napoleon pressed the directors to send him to dictate harsher terms than those previously imposed. When they balked, he set off for Toulon, and on the 9th of May, sailed aboard Vice Admiral Brueys' flagship L'Orient. His squadron, part of a larger fleet of over 300 vessels, carrying almost 37,000 troops. Napoleon paused to compel the surrender of Malta, and fortuitously eluding a British fleet under Rear Admiral Nelson, began to disembark his army at Marabout Bay on the 1st of July. Exactly a month later, Nelson returned to find Brueys' fleet in Aboukir Bay and destroyed it at the Battle of the Nile. Napoleon would have to fight with his lines of communication severed. On the 2nd of July, Napoleon's troops seized Alexandria, and he then set out on a desert march towards the Nile, which brought his men to the edge of mutiny. The Mamluks, ruling what was in theory a Turkish province, sent a detachment forward, while the remainder concentrated near Cairo. Napoleon reached the Nile on the 10th of July, and on the 13th of July, there was a battle between French and Mamluk flotillas, won by the French when the opposing flagship blew up. The decisive clash came northwest of Cairo on the 21st of July, known as the Battle of the Pyramids. Murad Bey's cavalry charged the French, formed up in great squares, and were beaten off with huge loss. Napoleon entered Cairo 2 days later. On the 11th of August, the Mamluk survivors were defeated at Salaya, and Napoleon told the Directory that the country is under our control and the people are becoming used to us. In fact, Murad Bey fought on, and Turkey's declaration of war inspired a rising in Cairo. The Turks, encouraged by a British naval detachment under Commodore Smith, prepared to counterattack, and Napoleon, never one to wait passively, set off to the Sinai in February of 1799. It took 11 days to take El Arish. Gaza fell without resistance, and Jaffa was stormed on the 7th of March, in a victory marred by the butchery of the town's garrison. Acre held out under Jezer Pasha, encouraged by the arrival of Smith and reinforcements. Kleber, marching inland, smashed the Turks at Mount Tabor on the 16th of April, but the siege of Acre stalled, and in May Napoleon decided to fall back. On the 25th of July, he beat a Turkish army landed by the Royal Navy in Aboukir Bay. But the Directory had concluded that Egypt was no longer important, for Pitt had assembled a second coalition. Napoleon sailed for France on the 22nd of August, leaving Kleber in command. It would be 2 years before the survivors returned home. We will now enter into Chapter 7, Brumaire and Marengo. If it had not been for you English, I would have been Emperor of the East, lamented Napoleon in later life. British sea power may have wrecked his Egyptian adventure, which achieved none of its strategic objectives, but the evidence of French ambition actually hastened the formation of the Second Coalition against Napoleon. Although the expedition diminished the Directory's stature, it enhanced Napoleon's. His unexpected return in October of 1799 affronted the directors, who gave him what he called a glacial reception. But coming just after the dispatch announcing his victory against the Turks at Abu Qir, it delighted the public, and Napoleon's journey from Fréjus to Paris was accompanied by wild enthusiasm. Napoleon reappeared at a crucial moment. Massena had just defeated the Russians in Switzerland, and an allied army would shortly be driven out of Holland. Royalist members of the Council of 500, the lower house of the legislature, had been expelled in 1797, and counter-revolutionary revolts in Brittany and the southwest had been suppressed. Although the council's extremist neo-Jacobins aired the old revolutionary rhetoric, the capital's appetite for violent politics seemed sated. Yet if France craved stability rather than more revolution, the status quo offered few attractions to ambitious generals. There were private tribulations. Josephine's spectacular adultery with a young officer, Hippolyte Charles, had exacerbated Napoleon. And on his arrival in Paris, he locked her out of his bedroom. Josephine and her children, Hortense and Eugène, noisily beseeched him to show mercy. Napoleon eventually opened the door, and their union was not again troubled. But Josephine now found her husband less pliable, and insisted that she break with her louche friends in the Directory crowd. Napoleon worked covertly with political supporters to develop his own role. Some, like Sieyès, wanted the executive strengthened at the expense of the legislature and needed a general to stage a coup. "You want power," said Foreign Minister Talleyrand, "and Sieyès wants a new constitution. Therefore, join forces." Napoleon's brothers Joseph and Lucien intrigued, and on the 25th of October, Lucien became president of the Council of 500. On the 9th of October, also known as the 18th of Brumaire, an alleged conspiracy provided the excuse to move on the two legislative assemblies, the Council of Ancients and the Council of 500, to St. Cloud, outside the capital. Given command of the troops in Paris, Napoleon harangued 10,000 soldiers into Tuileries Gardens. On the 19th of Brumaire, Napoleon went to St. Cloud, but panicked when confronted by furious deputies. Lucien told the soldiers that the deputies sought to murder their general, and Murat, who had commanded the cavalry in Italy and Egypt, led them forward. They burst into the chamber, and by nightfall there was a 3-man provisional executive dominated by Napoleon. A new constitution was ratified by plebiscite in December, with Bonaparte as first consul, Cambacérès as second, and Lebrun as third. His political power secure, Napoleon turned his attention to military affairs. The French faced one large Austrian army in the Black Forest and another on the upper Danube, with a smaller force in Italy. Napoleon compiled plans for an advance on Vienna, but the Austrians launched an unexpected offensive in Italy, and in May of 1800, Napoleon took his army over the St. Bernard Pass, reaching Milan on the 2nd of June. Determined to bring General Melas to battle, Napoleon was caught off balance on the 14th of June when the Austrians attacked part of his army at Marengo. He sent a desperate message, "Come back, in God's name," to Desailles, who arrived in mid-afternoon, and declared that the battle was lost. But there was still time to win another. As his infantry counterattacked, the younger Kellerman charged the Austrian flank, and within minutes the Austrians collapsed. Marengo did not end the war, and it took Moreau's victory of Hohenlinden on the 3rd of December to persuade the Austrians to sign the Peace of Luneville on the 9th of February, 1801. Britain agreed to terms in October of 1801 and confirmed them by the Peace of Amiens in March of 1802. Napoleon, both victor and peacemaker, was appointed consul for life, the sole head of the state, on the 2nd of August. We will now move on to Chapter 8, Ruler and Lawgiver. As emperor, Napoleon remodeled the French state, sweeping away the feudal vestiges of the old regime and bestowing on France an efficient bureaucracy and a single code of law. In 1803, the Vendéan leader Georges Cadoudal planned to assassinate Napoleon. The plot failed, and its participants were executed, although Moreau, the victor of Hohenlinden, against whom evidence was weak, was allowed to go into exile. To underline the seriousness of the regime's response, the young Duc d'Enghien, heir to the Prince de Condé, head of a collateral branch of the Bourbons, was kidnapped from the German state of Baden, brought back to France, and shot for being an émigré in foreign service. All this helped create the climate in which the Senate, gently prompted, proclaimed Napoleon emperor on the 18th of May, 1804. The customary plebiscite confirmed his elevation. To win the Pope's approval, Napoleon went through a religious form of marriage to Josephine in private, and when he was crowned on the 2nd of December, he was anointed by the Pope, but placed the crown on his own head. Napoleon had already begun the reconstruction of France. He emasculated the representative institutions he inherited with a Senate, a legislative body, and a tribunate, the latter abolished in 1807 for venturing mild criticism. The executive, in contrast, was strengthened enormously. Most ministries had been reorganized after the Revolution, and under Napoleon there were logically divine ministries of the interior: foreign affairs, finances, justice, war, marine, and the colonies, and police, with a state secretariat to coordinate and direct policy. There was, unsurprisingly, neither cabinet nor first minister. The Council of State was the most influential new institution. Its members were chosen widely from distinguished men across the political spectrum. It prepared laws and regulations, formed a reservoir of senior officials for special tasks, and subjected ministries to expert supervision and review. These supervisory duties eventually led to the creation of a corpus of administrative law, and the council was to develop into what one historian called the unshakable cornerstone of French bureaucracy. Powerful central institutions controlled local administration. Authority in a department lay in the hands of its prefect, appointed from and answerable to Paris, whose uniform betokened his status within a disciplined hierarchy. His sub-prefects, less gorgeously uniformed, were often local men, but had no electoral constituency, and like their master, were the government's creatures. These arrangements in part harked back to the intendants of Louis XIV, but the fact that the Revolution had felled a forest of medieval survivals permitted comprehensive centralization that the old regime, hedged about with feudal relics and customary laws, could never have achieved. When central government was strong, the new system worked well, but in his desire to destroy local power, Napoleon removed regional counterweights to instability at the center. Replacement of the varied laws of France by a single code had begun under the old regime and continued with the Revolution. Napoleon accelerated the process in 1800 by giving a group of distinguished lawyers 5 months to sort things out. It took until 1804 for the code to be agreed, but such was the measure of its success that all 2,281 articles could be contained in one volume. The code enshrined equality before the law, religious toleration, and the rights of property, which was to be inherited equally by all legitimate children. The Code of Civil Procedure was more complex, and although the new criminal code seems draconian to modern eyes, it was a good deal more reasonable than, for example, British practice at the time. Napoleon's concordat with the Pope in 1801, which enabled the latter to anoint the emperor at his coronation, accepted that Catholicism was the religion of the majority, but placed bishops under prefectural control and paid state salaries to the clergy. Monastic orders were allowed back into France, but papal bulls could be published only with governmental assent. Although the church retained control of primary education, the new secondary system focused on élite lycées, boarding schools whose uniformed pupils were destined for the most important posts in the bureaucracy, backed by secondary schools whose education fitted pupils for lesser commercial and administrative positions. There were specialist, higher schools for education, medicine, pharmacy, law, and the army. Napoleon's administrative and legislative achievements outlived him, and many are reflected in France today. Chapter 9. Ulm and Austerlitz. The Peace of Amiens was only a pause in hostilities, and in 1805 the Third Coalition took the field against France, with Britain providing its gold and sea power, and both Austria and Russia its manpower. The plan of the Austro-Russian allies emphasized operations in North Italy, but was flawed by its complexity and divided command, and was predicated on the Russians arriving in Bavaria by mid-October. Napoleon's response was wholly characteristic. His Grande Armée was massed at Boulogne on the Channel coast, ready to invade England, but it became obvious that the naval superiority upon which this depended would not be secured, despite Spain's entry into the war on the side of France. Once this was clear, and in fact before the decisive naval battle of Trafalgar was actually fought, Napoleon decided to instead launch more than 200,000 men towards the Danube along parallel routes. He collected Bavarian allies en route, enveloping the leading Austrian army under Mack, before the Russians could intervene, then went on to defeat the main Allied armies. The operation hinged on Napoleon's use of corps d'armée, which would allow self-contained formations, varying in size from 14,000 to 41,000 men, to march separately but fight united. Subsidiary theaters were left to subordinates. Massena would fix the Archduke Charles in northern Italy. Sancerre would prevent an Allied descent on Naples, and Brune would watch the Channel. Most of his men were already moving when Napoleon left Boulogne on the 3rd of September, and his advanced guards crossed the Rhine between Strasbourg and Mainz on the 15th of September. Mack, blinded by French cavalry, had no idea what was about to burst upon him, and the French began to wheel south on the 2nd of October, cutting in behind Mack and pushing forces eastwards to find blocking positions in case the Russians arrived. Mack managed to get some cavalry away, but he surrendered his encircled main body of 60,000 men at Ulm on the 20th of October. Napoleon had no intention of stopping, for there were still substantial Russian and Austrian forces in the field, and there was every danger that Prussia, some of its outlying territory already violated by the French advance, would join the coalition. Napoleon decided to march on Vienna, hoping that by threatening the Austrian capital, he would induce his opponents to fight. With his leading cavalry snapping at Kutuzov's rearguards, now falling back eastwards, Napoleon left Munich on the 28th of October, but soon discovered that Murat had mishandled the pursuit. Not only had this enabled Kutuzov to get away, but it permitted him to savage part of Mortier's corps at Dürrenstein on the 11th of November. Vienna, reached by the French on the 12th of November, was undefended, but the Allies broke clear of the city and took up a position near Olmütz, with secure lines of communication running east and north. The French, in contrast, were at the end of their tether, worn out by the long advance, and with fragile communications stretching westwards. Napoleon knew that delay would make his enemies stronger, and might enable those Austrians falling back from Italy to join the fray. He needed a decisive battle, but if his enemies recognized this, they might keep out of reach. Accordingly, he used both diplomatic and military means to suggest that he was hopelessly weak, apparently seeking an armistice while he summoned his outlying corps to join him as soon as possible. On the 1st of December, the French army formed up 10 kilometers, or 6 miles, west of the small town of Austerlitz, its left flank on the Brunn-Olmütz road, and its right on the ponds near Telnitz, with the Pratzen Plateau to its front. Much of the army was invisible to the Allies, who planned to attack the French right before swinging north to cut their line of retreat. There would be a subsidiary attack in the north. The Allied juggernaut lumbered forward before dawn on the 2nd of December. But as the sun broke through, Napoleon launched Vendôme and Saint-Hilaire against the Pratzen, no longer properly defended as the Allies slid southwards, and gained possession of the vital ground in the very center of the battlefield, cutting off the Allied jab at the shoulder. His right flank held out, though under pressure, and his left checked the attack up the road. Napoleon strengthened his center before striking hard southeastwards. The Allies lost 27,000 men, about a third of their strength. French casualties totaled 9,000. The news broke the spirit of British Prime Minister William Pitt, who was dead within 8 weeks. On the 26th of December, Napoleon and Emperor Francis of Austria signed the Treaty of Pressburg, which, against French Foreign Minister Talleyrand's advice, took substantial territories away from Austria and imposed a severe financial indemnity. We will now enter into Chapter 10, War at Sea. In a naval war of skirmish and blockade, punctuated by infrequent larger-scale fights, it was superior British seamanship and tactics that enabled the Royal Navy to emerge victorious. The navies of the Napoleonic age counted their strength in ships of the line. These were three-masted sailing vessels mounting heavy guns, the whole reason for their existence, and they fought in a line of battle, trading close-range broadsides with their opponents. There was little technological difference between opposing fleets, and so seamanship and tactics were of fundamental importance in enabling admirals to squeeze every morsel of advantage from wind and tide. Getting the weather gauge of an opponent was highly desirable, and in 1794, Howe maneuvered for days in the Atlantic to get upwind of the French, before fighting and winning the glorious 1st of June, the first naval battle between the Royal Navy and the Navy of Revolutionary France. Navies customarily fought in line. However, if both sides remained in line, although they might do fearful damage to one another, it was rare for battles to be decisive. Wooden warships had an astonishing capacity to absorb punishment. Fire followed by explosion in the ship's magazine was what finished L'Orient at the Nile and Achille at Trafalgar. Capturing an opposing vessel usually required it to be boarded, almost impossible to achieve in linear battle. But British admirals were increasingly prepared to change the rules. At Camperdown in 1797, Duncan broke the Dutch line, capturing 9 of their 16 ships of the line. Breaking the rules lay behind Nelson's great victory at Trafalgar. Early in 1805, Napoleon instructed Villeneuve to lure Nelson's blockading fleet into the West Indies, and then return to collect the Brest squadron before escorting his invasion barges across the Channel. Although Villeneuve succeeded in the first part of his mission, on his return to home waters, he was unnerved by an inconclusive action with Calder and sailed south to Vigo, moving down to join the Spanish fleet at Cadiz. Although there was no longer any strategic justification for battle, for the Grande Armée had now moved eastwards, Villeneuve put to sea with 33 ships of the line on the 20th of October. When the fleets met the following day, the British, with 29 ships of the line, were at a slight numerical disadvantage, but were infinitely superior in terms of ship handling and gunnery. Nelson broke the Franco-Spanish line into two places, bringing about a series of vicious, close-range actions in which British skills were at a premium. Although Nelson was killed in the battle, his fleet captured no fewer than 17 ships, though 2 were subsequently recaptured and more lost in the storm that followed. It was a decisive victory, destroying any chance of a French invasion of Britain. As Trafalgar shows, once a linear battle had become a melee, ships hammered away at one another at point-blank range. A British lieutenant recalled that he could have thrown a biscuit onto the enemy warships on either side of his own at Trafalgar. Captains strove to maintain a high rate of fire and to rake an enemy vessel through its poorly protected stern, and here superior skill told heavily. The Royal Navy, longer at sea and able to keep its crews exercised regularly, enjoyed a real advantage over its opponents, often confined to harbor. Moreover, assertions that British seamen were unwilling victims of press gangs and subject to constant brutality are wide of the mark. Most British warships had well-disciplined, confident crews, welded together into lethal fighting machines. The disparity in casualties at Trafalgar was shocking. The captain of the French Fagot reported that 3/4 of his men were hit, and the Spanish Santa Trinidad, with 136 guns, the largest ship on either side, had 400 men killed and 200 wounded. In contrast, Nelson's flagship Victory, the hardest-hit British ship, lost 57 killed. Battle on this scale is rare, and the Royal Navy's victories did not give it anything that it had previously lacked, for it consistently enjoyed command of the sea. It was usually not in the French interest to risk a major clash, for French possession of what theorists were to term a fleet in being tied down the bulk of the Royal Navy's strength without risk. For all the drama of the battle, like Trafalgar, British maritime strength was generally used in blockade, which made it difficult for shipping to enter or leave French-controlled ports. Alfred Thayer Mahan, the American theorist of naval sea power, was in essence correct to write, "Those far-distant, store-beaten ships, upon which the Grand Army never looked, stood between it and the dominion of the world." Yet the British did not have things all their own way. French naval vessels or privateers, private warships with a government's letter of marque, often escaped from blockaded ports to wreak havoc on merchantmen. Although the damage done by these commerce raiders was irritating, 2,861 British merchant ships were lost to enemy action between 1793 and 1800, it was not decisive. The threat posed by French commerce raiders never approached the damage done to Britain by U-boats in the 2 world wars. In contrast, the prefect of the Lower Seine glumly reported in 1811 that commerce is non-existent. It cannot prosper without maritime peace. We will now enter into Chapter 11, Napoleon's Art of War. A contradiction lies at the heart of Napoleon's generalship. On the one hand, he had undertaken a painstaking study of military theory and recommended deep thought as well as deep analysis. On the other, much about him went beyond the rational. "I have fought 60 battles, and I have learned nothing which I did not know at the beginning." He rejected formulaic schemes, maintaining, "I have never had a plan of operations." He was meticulous in his study of maps and detailed information, and wrote, I am accustomed to thinking out what I shall do 3 or 4 months in advance, and I base my calculations on the worst conceivable situation." In short, Napoleon's teeming brain wove together intellect, instinct, experience, and intuition to an unusual degree. Napoleon never wrote systematically on the art of war, and his multi-volume correspondence can be variously construed, with consistencies being counterbalanced by contradictions. In part, this is because he did not wish to tell his enemies, or his subordinates either, quite how he operated. In part, It was, as the distinguished Napoleonic scholar David Chandler observed, that his genius was essentially practical rather than theoretical. And in part, it reflected the tendency, not confined to great generals, to remember things as they might have been and not as they really were. His many interpreters added their own gloss to phrases in which Napoleon, writing in a language whose complexities he never fully grasped, may not necessarily have invested much importance. The essence of Napoleon's generalship was a desire to seek out the enemy's army and to break it, thus, as he hoped, depriving the hostile state of the means of resisting him. In 1797, he affirmed, "There are in Europe many good generals, but they see too many things at once. I see only one thing, namely the enemy's main body. I try to crush it, confident that secondary matters will then settle themselves." If this approach often worked, perhaps most effectively in the case of Prussia in 1806, there were times, most dramatically in Russia in 1812, when it did not. Napoleon had no doubt that the battle lay at the heart of war. Like the 18th century theorist Guibert, whose works he admired, he rejected the notion of cautious campaigning sprinkled with sieges. It is upon the field of battle that the fate of fortresses and empires is decided. He was amoral, arguing that in war all that is useful is legitimate, and harsh utilitarianism characterized his approach to the losses that battle inevitably produced. He warned the Austrian statesman Metternich that a man like me troubles himself little about the lives of a million men. Yet there were moments when common humanity broke through, and after the Battle of Eylau in 1807, he admitted to Josephine that this is not the pleasant part of war. Napoleon generally conceded an offensive plan based on detailed study, but ensured that there were many alternatives in case the master plan foundered. He emphasized the security of his forces so that an enemy would find it hard to glean intelligence, and at the same time sought to mystify and confuse his opponents. Speed was of the essence. I may lose a battle, but I shall never lose a minute. For Napoleon appreciated the need to maintain a higher tempo than his enemy, who consequently lost freedom of action. He sought to concentrate against the decisive point, and some commentators wasted their energies on debating whether this was the enemy's strongest or weakest point. It might be either, depending on the circumstances. What mattered was breaking the enemy's equilibrium, and then the rest is nothing. He often wrote about the importance of the moral as opposed to the material. Perhaps most usefully in 1808, in war, 3/4 turns on personal character and relations. The balance of manpower and materials counts only for the remaining quarter. The Corps d'Armée system enabled him to practice his 3 favorite strategic concepts. The advance of envelopment embodied pinning an enemy army to its position while he struck at its flanks or rear. In the strategy of central position, Napoleon sought to place himself between 2 opponents and to switch forces to defeat each in turn. Lastly, in strategic penetration, Napoleon moved swiftly through an enemy's defensive cordon to seize a center of operations from which he could execute another strategic ploy as the situation permitted. These were ideas rather than formula, and it was in their combination that Napoleon showed his real genius.